Well, good morning. Today we're going to talk about things that you can't read about in the academic literature. And this is the results of several conferences that we had, we participated in which scientists and decision makers were brought together in order to discuss how best to carry out and improve our assessments and how best to improve the decision process. The first of these was held in La Jolla in '09, and it was entitled Impacts of Climate Change on California and Himalayan Asia. And I'll talk about the California's issues tomorrow, or Friday. But the whole idea was that both of us are suffering from melting snows, and it will impact our water resources. And so we wanted to compare how Asia, Himalayan Asia, and California were approaching their melting snows problem. This stimulated a follow-on conference in the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, in which the goal was to tighten up on the science of how we connect melting snows to river flows. And then finally, the third conference was held in the Vatican in 2011, and it was entitled The Fate of Mountain Glaciers in the Anthropocene. And here the issue was, to what extent can we, in all honesty, say that the observed retreats of glaciers are due to climate change and not to other causes? Very complicated issue. So the general conclusion that I reached and that we reached was that there was a unifying theme on how ice and snow, mountain ice and snow, and rivers interact and how climate change will affect them. And in fact, if you think about all of the issues that you go from the melting snows to the water availability of the people along the river, you get an outline of the kinds of issues that a full-up, intelligent assessment would contain. It would take note of the fact that every river passes through different landscapes and climates, and by societies with different structures, needs, and ways of reaching decision. And so you'd really like to ask questions like, well, how will the population and the water demand evolve? How does climate change factor into their environment and socioeconomic issues? How much time do they have to develop adaptive responses, and what options will the decision makers have? And finally, how can we in the science, technology, and policy community help? Let's see now. What am I doing wrong? Here we go. So I'll talk a bit about California's issues with melting snow in the next lecture. And so I thought for us here in California, of course, the most interesting thing was to hear from our colleagues from Asia, and particularly to look at the Himalaya mountains. There are some beautiful pictures there. The essential point for this talk is that the headwaters of Asia's 11 largest rivers are in the Himalayan region. And as you know, as we said earlier, 1/6 of the world's population uses their water in some way or another. So the issue proved to be complex, as is always the case when you start looking in detail at regional issues, and you just don't say the climate is changing, the climate is changing. You look at the changing in the prevailing weather patterns, which have climate change in the background. So if you do that, you look and you'll see that there's a very large east-west difference in the behavior of the climate and prevailing weather patterns in the Himalayas. This is a UNEP slide, the UN Environmental Program slide that they made for us. And the basic issue is that if you look to the west, on the left in that slide, the weather comes from the west. Whereas for the rest of the Himalayan change, the weather comes from the monsoon, basically from the south, the precipitation creating weather. There are a number of other regional variations, but the essential point to realize is that even though it's one mountain chain, it's so big that it has a variety of regional prevailing weather patterns which affect the precipitation, the snow melt, the runoff in the rivers.
What's that pink line? Does that just represent the edge of the Himalayas?
Yeah, that's I think just to show you what the southern edge of the Himalayas looks like. Okay? So UNEP, UN Environmental Program, has tried to calculate how much of each river's annual flow comes from the melting snows. And here you see a map that also shows their catchment. And you'll see that these are really iconically important rivers: the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Yellow River, and some that we don't know so well in Central Asia, like the Tarim. And what you see is that each river basin depends on the mountain snows in a different way. This is a statistical study, but it, of course, depends on the regional variations in weather patterns. Of the ones that are the most dependent, the Indus is I think, the most dependent on mountain snows. About 45% of its entire flow come from the melting Himalayas. And this is critical. This is a critical issue then for Pakistan, because 70% of the Indus water is redirected into agricultural irrigation. In addition, even when you look at the Ganges, where there's a 9% of the flow only, the Ganges does provide a lot of flow outside of the monsoon region. Okay? So if you look at the Ganges and you just ask, what kind of questions, scientific questions now, would you ask if you wanted to have an integrated river assessment, if you wanted to know how the changing climate will affect the water availability in the Ganges, and from there, the populations and the agriculture? So here are the list of the questions that we developed. How does changing climate affect Gangotri? That's the origin of the Ganges. How does it affect its snows and glaciers? What are the impacts of black carbon, which we've heard about, on the snowmelt and on the monsoon, both of which are results possibly of climate change? How much Ganges water comes from the mountains? What fraction comes from the monsoon? What fraction is stored underground after it melts and only arrives in later years? How does all of this change with climate? What's the impact of the large withdrawals from the aquifer underneath the Ganges? Why is the monsoon becoming more variable? And what can we expect? Can we even predict the variability of the monsoon? Key scientific question. And then finally, how do all of these things change what is important, which is agricultural productivity and food security? Another issue, another interesting river, equally important to its country, China, is the Yangtze. And the same set of scientific issues would apply to the Yangtze. But our colleague Josh Graf Zivan has pointed out that the social issues and the political issues associated with water management in the Yangtze are also of very great importance. At our conference, we heard from one of the chief water planners for China from Beijing, and she outlined a very strong and very well-constructed plan for the management of all the waters in the Yangtze. At the same time, however, our question was, how will they carry out this plan? Is it the right plan, and is it adapted to the politics of the country? Because the primary responsibility for implementing environmental actions are the provinces themselves, and they act independently in many cases of Beijing. And so seeing how the Chinese actually deal with the changing, declining water supply of the Yangtze will probably be a very good indicator of how they will deal with other very large environmental issues. And I think it's worth pointing out that they have started a project to divert about 1/3 of the Yangtze's flow north to the Yellow River so that Beijing can get its water. They did this in the year 700 AD approximately as well. But a great many things about Chinese welfare will depend on how they deal with the Yangtze. So, and there was even a time when the Yangtze ran dry at its mouth in Shanghai. The Vatican Conference, on the other hand, took a look primarily at the glaciers in our current period of climate warming, which is, as you know, now called the Anthropocene, the geological era in which human beings dominated the behavior of the Earth's surface. And they looked at all of the factors associated with actually assessing the significance of glacial retreat. And at the end of the day, after this discussion, they agreed when warming has only been 0.8 degrees centigrade since pre-industrial, they noticed that glaciers are shrinking in area worldwide, highest rates at lower elevations, and the widespread loss of glaciers is the clearest evidence where we have a change in the climate system. And they found these changes in the tropical areas, in the temperate areas, and the polar regions. This is not to say that the issue wasn't complicated, because even in the, what did I do here? Here we go. Even in the Himalayas, we will find that some glaciers will be advancing and others retreating, depending on the local topography and local weather patterns and changes. So it's not a uniform pattern. In addition, it's difficult to know how to count the rate of glacier decline, because as they retreat, they often fragment. And so it's possible to say there are more glaciers in a certain area than there were 20 years ago, and yet the net glacier area will be smaller. So it takes a considerable degree of judgment to reach this conclusion, and I think the problem requires considerably more examination. But here was the key issue. How do we know that glacial retreat, which has been going on since the end of the Ice Age, and has been going on especially since the end of the Little Ice Age 300 or 400 years ago, how do we know that glacial retreat that we are seeing is not due to a very large climate pattern and not the recent warming? And this is a very difficult issue to answer, because most of the records we have for glaciers have only been accumulated since the 1970s, when the climate change issue started becoming salient. But there is one data set for the Morteratsch Glacier in the Alps that goes back about 160 years, and that record shows a slow decline on which the recent rapid decline is superimposed. And so that is a key bit of data. But most of the other glaciers that we have cannot attest to the same fact. Tropical glaciers in the New World, basically in South America, NASA did a comprehensive study, and they have shown that there's been a 27% loss in glacial area in 20 years, and that this is going to be, and this is a strong indication, since it is so uniform across the tropics. It's also going to affect water availability for a country that's completely dependent. Its population is completely dependent on Andean water. Take a look at the picture. To the left is the coast. All the population lives there. To the right is the rainfall and the rainforest, which comes in from the east and stops at the Andes, and that brown area is also the place of Peru's rainforest. So the people live in one area, the rainfall lives in the other, the precipitation, and the people. If you've been to coastal Peru, it's a complete desert. Hardly anything grows, and there's something like 61 small rivers from the Andes from which the population gets its water. So perhaps a country very dependent on the snowmelt issue, even more than California, might be Peru. Here's a lovely picture I'd like to show you. Going back to the glacial melt. Here's the southern Patagonian ice field, and one of our colleagues from NASA in the shuttle took that picture. International Space Station, sorry. And it's one of the largest areas of freshwater ice on the Earth outside the polar regions. Well, there have been careful studies of the ice volume in this case. Patagonian ice fields carried out by NASA, Eric Rignot. And the essential point there is that the glaciers have been retreating, and the retreat has accelerated in the last 5 years of the data record, which went up to 2000 at that time. And because you could, by synthesizing digital elevation models, Landsat measurements of the area, and in the year 2000, digital allocation models, Landsat, and others, you could try to estimate the rate of loss of ice volume. And if you assume that all that ice turns to water and gets into the oceans, you'd find that this Patagonian ice fields are contributing about 1 centimeter per century to sea level rise. So this is a transition. This marks a transition then to the next issue about climate change adaptation, sea level rise.